Racism doesn't begin with a punch. Sometimes it begins with a single assumption that changes everything. The morning sun cast long golden shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as thousands of American flags fluttered gently in the warm Memorial Day breeze, each one standing beside a name that had once belonged to someone who never came home. Families gathered quietly. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder in pressed uniforms, and children clutched white roses without fully understanding why so many grown men and women struggled to hold back tears. The air carried the distant sound of a military bugle, solemn and unforgettable, wrapping every visitor in a silence that demanded respect. Standing a few steps away from the crowd was Marcus Reed, a 40-year-old black veteran whose charcoal suit was perfectly pressed except for the small silver trident pin resting on his lapel. His eyes never wandered toward the television cameras or the local reporters. Instead, they remained fixed on a polished granite memorial where 6 names reflected beneath the morning light. Every one of those names belonged to men who had once laughed beside him, trained beside him, trusted him with their lives, and never returned home. Marcus slowly removed a folded American flag from his hands and carefully placed it beneath the memorial, taking an extra moment to straighten one corner before quietly stepping back. His face remained calm, but behind that calm lived memories no holiday parade could ever erase. Around him, strangers smiled politely, assuming he was simply another veteran paying his respects. None of them noticed the way he instinctively scanned every entrance, every nearby rooftop, every unfamiliar movement without appearing to move at all. Old habits rarely disappeared. They simply became quieter with time. A few yards away, Officer Daniel Briggs watched Marcus from beside his patrol vehicle. The white police officer narrowed his eyes as he noticed the military pin, the confident posture, and the composed expression that never seemed uncertain. Something about Marcus bothered him, though he couldn't explain why. Instead of seeing a grieving veteran, he convinced himself. He was looking at someone pretending to belong somewhere he didn't. Bias whispered louder than reason. As families continued laying flowers across the memorial, Briggs stepped away from his cruiser and moved directly toward Marcus with growing confidence, ignoring the respectful atmosphere surrounding the ceremony. Several nearby visitors noticed the officer approaching but assumed he was offering assistance or security during the event. Marcus heard the footsteps before anyone else did. He slowly turned, his expression steady, his voice calm, offering nothing more than a courteous nod. Briggs didn't return it. Instead, he questioned Marcus's presence with an edge that immediately drew uneasy glances from nearby veterans. Conversation stopped. Flags continued fluttering overhead, but the peaceful rhythm of the ceremony seemed to hesitate. Marcus answered each question politely, never raising his voice, never matching the officer's suspicion with anger. Yet every calm response only appeared to deepen Briggs's certainty that something wasn't right. Then, in front of families honoring the fallen and children holding tiny American flags against their chests, Briggs suddenly lunged forward to restrain Marcus, convinced he was stopping a threat no one else could see. Gasps echoed across the memorial grounds as flowers slipped from trembling hands and phones slowly lifted into the air. Marcus never resisted. He simply looked beyond the officer's shoulder toward the rows of white headstones stretching across the hillside, almost as if he refused to let this moment become about himself. What no one gathered there could possibly know was that the story unfolding before their eyes had begun years earlier on battlefields thousands of miles away. And before another sunrise would pass, a courtroom would become the place where an entire nation discovered exactly who Marcus Reed had always been. 3 hours earlier, the city had awakened beneath a cloudless sky, and Memorial Day had begun the way Marcus Reed believed it always should, with gratitude instead of celebration. Before the crowds arrived, and before the television cameras searched for emotional moments, he had driven alone through quiet streets toward Arlington National Cemetery, with a single white rose resting on the passenger seat beside him. The radio softly played patriotic music between interviews with veterans whose voices carried equal parts pride and sorrow. Marcus eventually turned the volume down until only silence remained inside the truck. He preferred remembering his teammates without distractions. For him, Memorial Day was never about speeches or applause. It was about promises that had survived long after missions had ended. He parked several blocks away, choosing to walk the remaining distance beneath rows of mature oak trees whose leaves swayed gently in the mild morning breeze. Families carrying small American flags passed him with warm smiles. Children laughed without understanding why some visitors quietly wiped tears from their faces. Marcus acknowledged everyone with the same respectful nod before continuing toward the memorial section he visited every single year without fail. He carried no medals on his jacket and wore nothing that demanded recognition. The small silver trident pin remained the only quiet reminder of a chapter he rarely discussed. Years had passed since his final deployment, yet discipline still shaped every movement. His shoulders remained straight. His breathing stayed measured. His eyes naturally noticed details most people overlooked, from unattended backpacks to emergency exits and subtle shifts within the gathering crowd. It was never fear. It was simply the way years of service had rewired his instincts. As he reached the polished memorial wall, Marcus carefully unfolded a handwritten note from his inside pocket. The paper had softened with age after being carried through countless memorial days. One by one, he quietly read each name engraved before him, allowing every memory to settle without rushing the moment. Some had been older than he was. Others had barely reached their 30s. Each represented laughter shared during impossible days, conversations beneath unfamiliar stars, and sacrifices that would never appear completely in history books. Marcus gently placed the folded letter beneath the white rose before. Taking one slow step backward, he closed his eyes for only a moment, not to escape the present, but to honor the past. Nearby, an elderly veteran noticed the silver pin on Marcus's lapel and offered a respectful salute. Marcus returned it with quiet humility before the older man continued walking with his family. Nothing about the exchange sought attention. It was simply one veteran recognizing another. Across the open lawn, Officer Daniel Briggs had just arrived to assist with event security. He accepted a cup of coffee from another officer while casually scanning the growing crowd. His attention drifted from families carrying flowers to volunteers arranging chairs until it settled on Marcus standing alone near the memorial. Something about Marcus's composed posture immediately captured his attention. Instead of seeing quiet respect, Briggs convinced himself he was observing unusual behavior. Confirmation replaced curiosity before a single conversation had taken place. As the ceremony prepared to begin, more visitors gathered around the memorial, creating a peaceful scene filled with flags, prayers, military music, and whispered conversations about loved ones who had served. Marcus remained exactly where he was, unaware that someone several yards away had already formed a conclusion before hearing his name, his story, or the reason he had come. Sometimes the most dangerous decisions are not made in moments of anger. They are made in moments when assumptions quietly replace the truth. Officer Daniel Briggs adjusted the radio clip to his shoulder while keeping his eyes fixed on Marcus Reed from across the memorial grounds. The longer he watched, the more convinced he became that something about the quiet veteran did not belong. Marcus had not raised his voice, approached anyone aggressively, or interrupted the ceremony in any way. He simply stood with calm dignity before the names of friends he had lost years ago. Yet to Briggs, confidence itself became suspicious. He turned toward another officer and spoke quietly, never taking his eyes off Marcus. The second officer glanced across the lawn, shrugged, and suggested leaving the veteran alone because he appeared to be honoring the holiday like everyone else. Briggs dismissed the suggestion almost immediately. In his mind, instinct mattered more than observation. He walked steadily across the grass, weaving between families carrying flowers and volunteers preparing the opening ceremony. Several people stepped aside politely, assuming he was responding to a routine security matter. Marcus heard the footsteps approaching and slowly turned before the officer spoke. His expression remained composed, and he offered a respectful greeting. "Good morning, officer." Briggs did not return the courtesy. Instead, he immediately began asking sharp questions about Marcus's identity, why he was standing there, and whether he had permission to be inside the memorial area. Marcus answered each question patiently, explaining that he visited every Memorial Day to honor 6 teammates whose names were engraved only a few yards away. He even gestured toward the white rose resting beneath the memorial, hoping the simple explanation would end the conversation. It did not. Briggs studied Marcus with growing skepticism, almost as though every calm answer confirmed his own assumptions. Nearby visitors gradually noticed the unusual exchange. An elderly woman carrying a small American flag slowed her pace. A father gently placed his hand on his young son's shoulder as both quietly watched from a respectful distance. Volunteers arranging chairs exchanged uncertain glances but remained silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt the solemn atmosphere of the day. Marcus reached slowly into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and explained that he carried identification if the officer wished to see it. Before the wallet could fully emerge, Briggs abruptly ordered him to stop moving and keep his hands where they could be seen. Marcus immediately complied without argument. Years of military discipline had taught him that remaining calm often prevented situations from becoming worse. He slowly lowered his hands and spoke in the same steady voice. "I am not here to cause any trouble, officer. I only came to honor my brothers." For a brief moment, it seemed the misunderstanding might finally end. Then a passing visitor quietly whispered that Marcus was probably telling the truth because he had seen him attend the ceremony in previous years. Instead of easing the tension, the comment appeared to harden Briggs's attitude. He stepped closer and insisted that Marcus answer additional questions before participating in the event. Around them, conversations faded. The opening music had not yet begun, yet the peaceful spirit of the morning was already changing. Several phones slowly appeared as people sensed something was not right. Marcus remained completely still, refusing to match suspicion with frustration. His eyes drifted for a single moment toward the memorial wall where the 6 names reflected beneath the morning sunlight. He silently reminded himself that this day belonged to them, not to him. What Marcus could not know was that within minutes those quiet recordings would spread far beyond the cemetery, reaching people who recognized not only the man standing before the officer, but also the extraordinary life he had spent trying to leave behind. The atmosphere that had felt so peaceful only minutes earlier now carried an uncomfortable stillness that spread through the crowd one silent glance at a time. Parents gently guided their children a few steps closer without fully understanding why they suddenly felt uneasy. Veterans who had gathered to remember old friends exchanged concerned looks but chose restraint, believing respect for the occasion mattered more than heated words. Marcus Reed remained exactly where he was, standing with quiet composure while Officer Daniel Briggs continued questioning him as though every answer required another challenge. "If you really served," Briggs said with a skeptical tone, "then prove it." Marcus looked directly at the officer, not with anger or defiance, but with the calm patience of someone who had spent years solving difficult moments without raising his voice. "I will gladly identify myself," he answered. "I only ask that we remember where we are today." For just a second, Briggs glanced toward the rows of white headstones stretching across the hillside. The reminder should have softened the conversation. Instead, he seemed determined to maintain control in front of the growing audience. He instructed Marcus to step away from the memorial so additional questions could be asked. Marcus quietly complied without complaint. As he carefully moved away from the white rows he had placed beneath the engraved names, several people watching from nearby began recording with their phones, not because they wanted confrontation, but because something about the exchange no longer felt right. An elderly Marine veteran finally stepped forward and spoke in a respectful voice. "Officer, that gentleman has been here before. He comes every Memorial Day." Briggs barely acknowledged the comment before asking the older veteran to remain outside the conversation. The silence that followed seemed louder than any argument could have been. Marcus slowly removed his wallet, keeping every movement deliberate and visible. Before he could fully present his identification, Briggs quickly closed the distance and physically redirected Marcus away from the memorial area, insisting that he follow instructions immediately. The unexpected action drew audible gasps from nearby families. A little girl holding a miniature American flag looked up at her mother with confusion, while her mother quietly pulled her closer. Marcus instinctively steadied himself without resisting. He neither raised his hands nor answered with force. Instead, he simply took one slow breath and said, "Officer, there is no need for this. I am cooperating." His measured voice contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding them. More visitors stopped walking. Some veterans lowered the caps they had been holding over their hearts. Even the musicians preparing for the ceremony paused as uncertainty spread across the memorial grounds. Briggs interpreted Marcus's calmness as stubbornness rather than discipline and called for additional officers to assist. Within moments, Marcus found himself escorted away from the ceremony while remaining fully cooperative, his eyes lingering one final time on the memorial where 6 names reflected beneath the morning sun. He had come to spend a few quiet minutes honoring men who never returned home. Instead, he was leaving before the ceremony had even begun. As he was guided toward a patrol vehicle, one young college student quietly uploaded a short video with a simple caption that read, "Something about this does not feel right." Within minutes, thousands of people had begun watching. By the time Marcus arrived at the local courthouse for an initial hearing later that afternoon, the recording had already reached military families, veterans organizations, and people who recognized a face that Marcus himself had spent years trying to keep out of the spotlight. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, a secure phone began ringing inside a quiet office, and the person who answered it stopped speaking the moment Marcus Reed's image appeared on the screen. The courthouse felt strangely quiet compared to the emotion that had unfolded only hours earlier. Outside, reporters had not yet gathered in large numbers, and most people walking through the security entrance believed they were witnessing another routine hearing that would be forgotten before sunset. Inside a modest holding room, Marcus Reed sat alone with his hands resting calmly on the table in front of him. His breathing remained steady. He had experienced situations filled with uncertainty before, although never like this. Across the hallway, Officer Daniel Briggs completed paperwork with growing confidence, convinced that his version of events would never be questioned. Several fellow officers exchanged casual conversation, treating the entire incident as another ordinary encounter that had simply attracted more attention than expected. Meanwhile, the short video recorded at the memorial continued spreading across social media at a pace no one inside the courthouse realized. Thousands of viewers noticed details that had escaped the hurried moment. They saw Marcus remain respectful. They saw families quietly watching. They saw the white rose left beneath the memorial. Most importantly, veterans across the country recognized something familiar in Marcus's posture long before they recognized his face. Nearly 300 miles away, inside a secure office overlooking Naval Station Norfolk, Commander Ethan Walker was reviewing Memorial Day messages from former service members when his phone vibrated with an urgent notification. The video appeared without explanation, accompanied by a simple question from another retired operator. "Is that Marcus?" Ethan pressed play. He watched the entire recording once without speaking. Then he watched it again. By the third viewing, his expression had changed completely. He enlarged the image until the silver trident pin became visible against Marcus's suit jacket. There was no longer any doubt. Ethan quietly stood, walked toward a window overlooking the base, and remained silent for several seconds before making a single phone call. "Find everyone," he said calmly. "Tell them it is about Marcus Reed." No dramatic explanation followed. None was necessary. Within minutes, retired teammates scattered across different states began receiving nearly identical messages. Some were attending local Memorial Day ceremonies with their families. Others were volunteering at veterans' hospitals or visiting the graves of friends they had served beside years earlier. Every conversation ended the same way. "Marcus needs us." No one asked whether the trip would be convenient. No one questioned the purpose. Airline reservations were changed. Pickup trucks left small towns. One retired helicopter pilot canceled a family barbecue. Another former medic quietly folded an American flag before leaving a cemetery where he had been visiting his father's grave. None of them spoke to reporters or posted emotional messages online. They simply started traveling. Back inside the courthouse, Marcus remained unaware that any of this was happening. His court-appointed attorney briefly reviewed procedural questions and suggested remaining patient until the hearing began. Marcus nodded politely, offering only a few quiet answers before thanking the attorney for his professionalism. He never mentioned his military background beyond confirming that he was a retired veteran. He never listed his commendations. He never described the missions that had defined much of his adult life. Some chapters, he believed, belonged only to those who had lived them together. As afternoon, sunlight stretched across the courthouse windows, the first vehicles carrying former teammates quietly entered the city limits. None wore uniforms anymore. None sought recognition. Yet each carried something far more powerful than rank. They carried years of earned trust, shared sacrifice, and an unbreakable promise that no member of their team would ever stand alone when the truth needed witnesses. The courtroom settled into the familiar rhythm of an ordinary afternoon docket, where papers shuffled quietly across polished wooden tables and whispered conversations faded beneath the steady ticking of the wall clock. Judge Eleanor Brooks reviewed the case file with calm professionalism while attorneys organized their notes and spectators filled the back rows with the quiet curiosity that often followed a story gaining attention online. Marcus Reed entered the courtroom without hesitation, wearing the same charcoal suit he had worn that morning at the memorial. Although hours had passed since the ceremony, the small silver trident pin still rested neatly on his lapel. He acknowledged his attorney with a respectful nod before taking his seat, his expression unchanged despite the attention surrounding him. Across the room, Officer Daniel Briggs appeared increasingly confident. He exchanged brief comments with department representatives and occasionally glanced toward Marcus with the assurance of someone who believed the facts would support every decision he had made. The courtroom doors remained closed as the hearing officially began. Judge Brooks welcomed everyone, reminded those present of courtroom decorum, and asked both sides to prepare their initial statements. Marcus answered every procedural question politely, never interrupting and never attempting to explain his past beyond confirming his identity as a retired veteran. He offered no dramatic speeches and made no effort to influence the room through emotion. His quiet dignity contrasted sharply with the growing speculation among spectators, many of whom had already watched the memorial video online. Some believed Marcus had been treated unfairly. Others reserved judgment until hearing the evidence. Yet, almost everyone sensed there was more to the story than anyone currently understood. Outside the courthouse, several vehicles quietly arrived within minutes of one another. Men stepped out wearing dark suits, polished shoes, and simple American flag lapel pins. None carried military decorations on display. None spoke to reporters gathering near the entrance. They acknowledged each other with subtle nods that required no introductions before walking together toward the security checkpoint with calm confidence. Court security processed each visitor routinely, unaware that many of them had once served together in some of the most demanding assignments imaginable. Inside the courtroom, Officer Briggs had just begun describing the events at the memorial when a quiet sound interrupted the room. The rear courtroom doors opened. Heads turned instinctively, expecting another late spectator or courthouse employee. Instead, one man entered with measured steps before taking a seat along the back row. Moments later, another followed. Then another. One by one, more men entered until nearly an entire row had quietly filled. They wore no uniforms, displayed no medals, and made no attempt to draw attention to themselves. Yet something about their discipline was unmistakable. Every movement reflected years of shared training and mutual respect. Marcus looked over his shoulder only once. The moment his eyes met the newcomers, an almost imperceptible smile crossed his face before disappearing just as quickly. He said nothing. He did not wave. He simply understood. Commander Ethan Walker entered last. His silver hair reflected the afternoon light as he paused briefly inside the doorway, scanning the courtroom before finding Marcus. He offered a single respectful nod, and Marcus returned it with the same quiet gratitude. The room remained silent, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Spectators exchanged puzzled glances. Even Judge Brooks briefly looked toward the unexpected visitors before returning her attention to the proceedings. No one had announced their arrival. No one explained who they were. Yet an undeniable feeling settled across the courtroom that the truth was only beginning to reveal itself. And before the day was over, every assumption made inside that room would be measured against something far greater than appearances. The silence inside the courtroom grew so complete that even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Judge Eleanor Brooks looked toward the newly arrived visitors with quiet curiosity before returning her attention to the hearing. Officer Daniel Briggs attempted to continue his statement, but the confidence that had carried him through the afternoon began to soften as he noticed every man seated in the back row watching with calm, unwavering focus. None of them appeared angry. None whispered among themselves. They simply observed, their presence carrying a quiet weight that was impossible to ignore. Marcus Reed remained seated beside his attorney with his hands folded neatly on the table. He never turned again to acknowledge the men who had entered because he already knew why they had come. They were not there to create a spectacle. They were there because years earlier they had made a promise that no member of their team would ever stand alone when the truth mattered. Judge Brooks invited the defense to present any additional information relevant to the case. Before Marcus's attorney could rise, Commander Ethan Walker respectfully stood from the gallery. "Your Honor," he said in a steady voice, "I respectfully request permission to address the court regarding Mr. Reed's character and military service." The courtroom became still once more. After confirming his identity and hearing no procedural objection, Judge Brooks granted permission. Ethan approached the front without haste, carrying only a slim folder that appeared almost ordinary. He placed it carefully on the lectern before looking briefly toward Marcus. "I have known Marcus Reed for more than 16 years, he began. "I did not come here because he asked me to. In fact, he would never ask. I came because there are moments when silence becomes a form of dishonesty." His words settled over the courtroom with quiet force. He explained that Marcus had served with distinction for years, earning the trust of every person beside him through discipline, humility, and an unwavering commitment to protecting others before himself. He never described classified operations or dramatic missions. Instead, he spoke about character. He spoke about the teammate who always volunteered for the hardest assignment without expecting recognition. He spoke about the man who checked on younger operators after exhausting training days, who remembered birthdays, who wrote letters to families when others found the words too difficult. Then Ethan gently opened the folder. Inside were official commendations, retirement records, and letters recognizing extraordinary service from military leadership. Judge Brooks accepted the documents while courtroom staff quietly reviewed them. Murmurs spread through the gallery as spectators realized the quiet veteran they had watched all afternoon had carried an extraordinary history without mentioning a single achievement himself. Ethan looked toward the back row where the other former operators remained seated. "Every man you see here served beside Marcus Reed," he continued. "Different years, different missions, different responsibilities. Yet every one of us answered the same phone call today without hesitation. That is because trust like this is not built in a week or a year. It is earned over a lifetime." One after another, the former teammates stood briefly in silent acknowledgement before sitting again. No applause followed. None was needed. The gesture alone carried more meaning than words could provide. Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment, visibly moved but refusing to let the attention become about him. Officer Briggs looked from the documents to the men filling the back row, and for the first time since Memorial Day had begun, certainty gave way to doubt. The assumptions that had once seemed unquestionable were beginning to unravel beneath the quiet testimony of people whose credibility had been forged through years of honorable service rather than loud declarations. Judge Eleanor Brooks remained silent for several moments as she carefully reviewed every page Commander Ethan Walker had submitted. The courtroom waited without interruption. Even the reporters who had quietly slipped into the gallery lowered their pens, sensing that the direction of the hearing had shifted. Marcus Reed continued sitting with the same composed expression that had defined him since the morning, never attempting to speak over anyone or draw attention to himself. Across the room, Officer Daniel Briggs stood noticeably quieter than before. The certainty that had once shaped every answer now seemed replaced by careful hesitation. Judge Brooks finally looked up from the documents and addressed both attorneys. She requested that the court immediately review all available video recordings from the memorial, including footage submitted by members of the public. Within minutes, several clips appeared on the courtroom monitor. Each recording captured the same event from a different angle. Together, they formed a far clearer picture than any single account could provide. The videos consistently showed Marcus standing peacefully near the memorial, placing flowers beneath the engraved names, answering questions respectfully, and complying with every instruction he received. Not once did he appear confrontational or disruptive. Several witnesses who had attended the ceremony also provided written statements describing the same sequence of events. One retired Marine confirmed that Marcus had quietly attended the Memorial Day ceremony for several consecutive years without incident. A volunteer coordinator testified that Marcus had arrived early, greeted staff politely, and spent most of his time honoring the names of fallen teammates. An elderly woman who had recorded part of the interaction explained that she felt compelled to preserve what she witnessed because the exchange seemed increasingly unfair despite Marcus remaining calm throughout. Judge Brooks listened carefully before turning toward the prosecution. She asked whether any evidence existed contradicting the consistent testimony now presented before the court. After a brief consultation, the prosecution acknowledged that the newly submitted recordings provided important context unavailable during the initial review. No dramatic argument followed. Instead, the courtroom experienced something far more meaningful. The truth quietly assembled itself piece by piece until speculation could no longer compete with the evidence. Judge Brooks then addressed Officer Briggs directly. Her voice remained professional, neither hostile nor emotional. She reminded him that public trust depends upon careful judgment, especially during solemn community events honoring military service. She emphasized that assumptions must never replace objective observation and that every citizen deserves to be treated with fairness and dignity regardless of appearance. Department representatives present in the courtroom informed the judge that an internal review had already begun after additional footage surfaced online. They confirmed that all available evidence would be examined thoroughly according to departmental policy and that appropriate administrative procedures would follow. No one celebrated the announcement. Marcus certainly did not. He simply lowered his eyes for a brief moment before quietly thanking the court for allowing every fact to be heard. Commander Ethan Walker looked toward his former teammate with unmistakable pride, not because Marcus had won an argument, but because he had never abandoned his principles while facing misunderstanding. The former operators seated in the gallery remained silent, their presence still reflecting the same discipline that had guided them throughout their years of service. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, the atmosphere no longer carried tension alone. It carried reflection. Many people entered that courtroom believing they already understood the story. They now realized they had only witnessed the beginning. Sometimes justice does not arrive through louder voices or greater force. Sometimes it arrives because patient truth is finally given the opportunity to stand where assumptions once stood. The courthouse emptied slowly as the late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the marble steps outside. Reporters gathered near the entrance hoping for dramatic statements, but none came. Marcus Reed walked through the front doors with the same quiet humility that had defined him from the beginning of the day. He paused only long enough to shake his attorney's hand and thank Judge Eleanor Brooks for ensuring every fact had been heard. Commander Ethan Walker and the former members of Marcus's team followed a few steps behind, not surrounding him for attention, but simply walking beside him the way they always had. Years had passed since they had worn matching uniforms, yet nothing had changed about the way they protected one another. A young reporter finally approached Marcus and asked whether he wanted to comment on everything that had happened. Marcus smiled gently before answering with the same calm voice that had carried him through every difficult moment. Today was never about me. Memorial Day belongs to those who never made it home. The reporter lowered her microphone, realizing that the man standing before her had no interest in turning personal hardship into public recognition. Instead of leaving the courthouse immediately, Marcus looked toward Commander Walker and quietly asked one simple question. "Do we still have time?" Ethan understood without needing further explanation. "We do," he replied. A few minutes later, several vehicles returned to Arlington National Cemetery. The official ceremony had already ended, and many visitors had gone home, leaving only scattered families, volunteers gathering chairs, and rows of American flags moving gently beneath the evening breeze. Marcus walked alone toward the memorial where he had begun his morning. The white rose he had placed earlier still rested beneath the engraved names, untouched despite everything that had happened. He knelt quietly, straightened one corner of the folded note beneath the flower, and stood once again before the 6 names carved into polished stone. Behind him, Commander Walker and every former teammate stopped several yards away. Without a single command being spoken, each man stood at attention in complete silence. No cameras directed them. No audience applauded. It was simply one final promise kept between brothers who understood that honor was measured by actions no one else might ever witness. Marcus raised his hand in a quiet salute that lasted only a few seconds before lowering it again. His eyes remained fixed on the memorial, and for the first time all day, peace finally returned to his expression. Across the country, the courthouse recordings and the memorial videos continued spreading online. Millions of people watched the story unfold from beginning to end. Many expected anger. Many expected revenge. Instead, they witnessed restraint, dignity, and the quiet strength of a man who never allowed another person's assumptions to define his character. Officer Daniel Briggs would face the administrative review already announced by his department, while community leaders called for renewed training focused on fairness, professionalism, and respect. Yet Marcus never spoke publicly about punishment. When asked later what lesson he hoped people would remember, he answered with a sentence that quickly reached veterans, families, and strangers across the nation. Respect is never proven by the uniform someone wears. It is proven by the way we choose to treat another human being. As the evening sky slowly darkened above the endless rows of white headstones, the breeze carried the American flags in gentle waves across the hillside. The names engraved in stone remained unchanged, but so did the values they represented. Courage without pride, service without recognition, strength without hatred. Because in the end, the greatest heroes are not remembered for the battles they won. They are remembered for the character they refused to surrender, even when the world gave them every reason to do so.